Welcome back, folks, to part 4 of our ecology unit. In this part, we're going to be talking about 8.5 community ecology and 8.6 biodiversity, and you can see the page numbers that coincide with that in your book. Let's start with communities. So, a biological community, as we've learned before, is an assemblage of populations of various species living close enough for potential interaction. In other words, it's all of the living organisms in a particular habitat or environment. And we can often classify the interactions between these organisms by whether they help, plus, harm, negative, or have no effect on the species that are around them. Okay? And we call those relationships between different species interspecific interactions. We've mentioned that before. Those interspecific interactions can affect survival and reproduction of each species, and we then summarize those with the positive, negative, and null effect. The types of interspecific interactions we're going to discuss, and we'll discuss all these so you don't have to freak and try to get them all down quick. Competition, predation, herbivory, which is just predation of plants, facilitation, and then symbiosis. The three of those forms, we talked about parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And in Bio 1, we talked about all of these except for facilitation. So a lot of this is going to be a review for you. All right, so competition. Interspecific competition is a negative interaction. It occurs when species compete for a resource in short supply. Like we got the cheetah and the lions competing for that dead gazelle, the two different types of apes competing for those bananas. They both get less than they would have gotten without the other ones there. Okay. If it's between different species, it's interspecific. And if we're competing between two species, I love this picture, like these two buzzards here, it's intraspecific. And here's a way to remember it: same with an A, intra with an A, and then differ, inter, for different species, interspecific. And you can take a look through this, guys. It just gives you the definition and kind of a T-chart on that to help you out. The competitive exclusion principle is when strong competition can lead to competitive exclusion and local elimination of a competing species. So the competitive exclusion principle states that two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. We used this example in Bio 1 as well, if you remember. So if you grew this critter in a petri dish, at first it has plenty of food, water, space, so it grows faster and faster, exponential growth, right? And then here, we start to reach our carrying capacity K. And the same thing happens for this dude. Great. If we put them both in the same petri dish, competing for the same resources at the same space at the same time, for a while they'll both do fine because there's enough resources to go around. But eventually, these blue guys had some slight advantage in obtaining resources or some slight advantage in reproduction. Doesn't take much. But they started out competing, and these ones will eventually go extinct. Okay. Or if it was in nature, they could emigrate or shift their niche a little bit and try to find something else. Speaking of niche, the sum of a species' use of the biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living resources is called our niche. We often think of niche as your ecological role or your job. For instance, your habitat is the area where so the environment is the big area where you live, right? But you don't go to every corner of, say, Jefferson County all the time. You tend to spend most of your time and do most of your stuff in your habitat. For you, that might be school, home, work, some friends' houses, maybe a couple relatives' houses, and the space in between. That's your habitat. Your niche is your role in that habitat. What do you eat? What eats you? Do you fertilize things? What's going on? Okay. Now, ecologically similar species can coexist in a community if there are one or more significant differences in the niches. Niche or niche both work. As we saw before, there was no difference, so they couldn't coexist. But if there's some difference, it is possible for them to coexist. One thing they can do is they can do resource partitioning. Is differentiation of ecological niches, enabling similar species to coexist. So we've got these birds here, and all on their own, they could live anywhere in this tree. But when they're all in the same area, they tend to partition off the tree and focus on different areas. They could all fight for the top of the tree or the outer edges of the tree if that's the best place. But that would be, as we saw, harmful for both of them. That'd be a negative negative. They'd both be getting less than they would have gotten before. So if they just agree to divide things up, and live in slightly different areas, they have a much easier time. It's kind of like if you're in track, right? There's lots of different events in track, and you may want to do all of them. You may want to be a decathlete or something, but that's not the way it works in high school track. So you've got to pick just a few events. Which events are you going to pick? You're going to pick the ones that you don't have as much competition in, or in other words, the ones you are more competitive in, and you're not even going to try to compete, say, the triple jump or something. Okay. Because of that. And that's kind of what's going on here. They'll shift a little bit. So, I'm a little bit better inside, and I'm a little better outside. So they'll fight for the outside. These guys will fight for the inside, and then we'll kind of separate it like that. You can see the same thing with these birds on the shoreline. Okay. They all are adapted to very slightly different niches, getting these things out of the sand and the dirt here. So rather than trying to, this guy trying to eat down here and up here, he just says, you know what? I'm going to go right here. This is my niche. This is my butter zone. This guy's butter zone's here. This one's here. There's a difference between fundamental niche and realized niche. A fundamental niche is the niche potentially occupied by that species. So down here, we've got these barnacles. Now, barnacles, they need to be in the water some of the time and out of the water some of the time. So we see them on the hulls of ships where they get in and out of the waves, or on the side of some whales sometimes where they're in and out of the waves. But we often see them in tidal zones, right? And you notice none of them live below low tide, because under there, they're always underwater. And above high tide, they're never in the water. So they have to live somewhere in this range. Now, these brown ones here, they can live anywhere in this range. That's their fundamental niche. But if you put them on a beach with these blue ones, their realized niche, where they really live, is just in the upper part, because these blue ones can only survive lower down. They need to be underwater more often, so they're fighting tooth and nail for this. They cannot live up here. These brown ones, it's like, you know what? You can take it. It's not worth the pain to fight you. I'll live up here where I don't have as much competition, and they're good to go. So we get fundamental niche versus realized niche. You can also do that same type of thing with day and night feeding. There's a couple of mouse species here, the golden spiny mouse. They both would prefer to be nocturnal, okay? But if they're in the same place, one will feed during the day and one will feed at night, and then they don't have to compete directly with each other for stuff. Now, that can lead then to something called character displacement. If you're starting to shift your niche a little bit because you're not as able to compete as well in that slightly different niche, now we are starting to separate things. So we're going to drive some evolutionary change potentially. So there's tendency for characteristics to be more divergent in sympatric populations of two species than in allopatric populations of the same two species. So characters are going to tend to be more different in sympatric populations of two species versus allopatric. First off, do you remember sympatric and allopatric? Put up a picture. So we've got these trees here, right? There's all by themselves, no competition, just all the same species. Here, this is a sympatric. They're in the same country, right? And here we got allopatric. They're on different sides. Why is there going to be more divergence in a sympatric situation? Yeah, because they have to compete directly with one another. So, maybe the sweet spot's kind of in the middle, but they say, they'll change. They have to change. They can't occupy the same exact niche. So one might go a little one way, one might go a little other. Whereas if they're on two sides of the mountains and they're all by themselves, they can take the whole fundamental niche. They don't need to have the realized niche. Over here, they got to stick with the realized niche. Here's a great example of it. On some of the Galapagos Islands, some of the finches, we can see the beak depth here. These guys have little beaks. These guys have big beaks. Better on big seeds and nuts. Better on small little soft things. We can see if it's only these guys on this island, their beak size kind of ranges right in here, from here to here. If the green ones are only on Daphne Island, they're here, But if we put them on the same island, it tends to look like this. So which of these is allopatric and which is sympatric? Yeah, these two are allopatric situations. They're all by themselves. Here, they got to share the resources. So here you can see these two, their beak sizes, if they're all by themselves, they don't have competition, their beak sizes overlap a lot. It's good to be kind of in the middle. You can eat the smaller things and you can eat the bigger things. So why wouldn't you be somewhere in the middle? Okay. But you notice how these guys are just slightly smaller and these guys are just slightly bigger on average? So if we put them both on the same island where they have to compete, these guys up here on this end of the spectrum, they don't have to compete at all for the biggest seeds. They've got it locked in. They have the least amount of competition. So they're going to thrive, more likely to live longer, more likely to have more kids. Their kids are more likely to be surviving. So the whole population will shift to the bigger depth beaks. Whereas these guys, if they're down on the lower end, they don't have any competition. They can eat the smallest stuff and the most delicate stuff, right? These guys are getting out competed all the time by these guys. So these guys over here, these little ones, they're the ones most likely to survive and have kids, and their kids are going to most likely to survive and have kids. And so that whole frequency of alleles tends to shift towards the smaller side, and we get character displacement. So the species become more different. Moving on to predation, it's a positive negative interaction. Obviously, it's positive for the predator, which kills and eats the prey, and it's negative for the prey. And there's a lot of adaptations we see for predators and for prey. Predators, they evolve to catch and kill, right? So they either evolve to become really fast, or they evolve to become slow and stealthy and camouflage so they can sneak up on things. But they usually have claws and fangs, maybe some poison. Okay. Prey, on the other hand, have different defenses adaptations. Behaviorally, they could be hiders. They could run fast. They could form herds or schools where, the weak get called out anyway. They can have alarm calls, like those squirrels we talked about, the blanding squirrels we talked about before, or morphological and physiological defense adaptations, like morphological is the spine, physiological is the smell of the skunk, different things to stay alive. We've talked about the coloration things before. If you are really nasty tasting, you tend to want to advertise it. That's your selling point. That's the point of having nasty tasting, is they eat you, but at least they won't eat your cousins and your brothers and your sisters. Because once they eat you, they say, oh, I don't want to eat something that looks like that. So they tend to have these colorations. Or you can have camouflage, cryptic coloration, where you blend in. This canyon tree frog is really hard to see on this granite, for instance. You can have Batesian mimicry, where the prey may get a lot of protection by looking like a predator. So here's a venomous snake, and here is a moth larva that looks a lot like a venomous snake, which is kind of cool. Or you have Mullerian mimicry, where you kind of coevolution. These things are both nasty. You don't want to mess with them. And it's helpful if they both evolve similar coloration, because then they're playing off each other's deterrence. Mimicry can also be used by predators to approach prey. Like this octopus is just nuts. Look at that. The mimic octopus can mimic the appearance and movement of more than a dozen marine animals. So there it's looking like a sea snake. Here it's like a flounder. Here it's like a stingray. And that allows it to sneak up on things. Okay. Herbivory is basically just predator-prey, but with plants and herbivores. Okay. Plants can't run away, so they got different defenses. They don't have any of that runaway signal calling kind of stuff. So they're doing it with mechanical things like thorns and stickers, or chemical defenses and poisons and things like that. We talked about symbiosis in Bio 1, and that is that close long-term relationship between two organisms or two species, where they're in direct and intimate contact with one another. Not predator-prey, that's direct and intimate, but it's short-term. We're talking long-term direct intimate contact. There are different forms of it. One is beneficial to both, and others are beneficial to one, but not the other. So parasitism is a type of symbiosis where the parasite generally gets nourishment from the host organism. So it's beneficial for the parasite, negative for the host. Mutualism is mutually beneficial. That's the one that's beneficial for both. And mutualism can be obligate, where they need each other to survive. One can't make it without the other one. They're obligated to survive together. They've co-evolved so closely that they have to be together. Or facultative, where both species can survive alone, but they derive a benefit if they're working together. Commensalism is kind of like a community. In commensalism, one benefits and the other could care less. It's neither helped nor harmed. Think about a spider building its web in a tree. Does it make any difference to the tree if the spider builds its web there? Probably not. But does the spider get home and a place to catch insects? Yeah. Or little fish schooling around sharks to eat the little leftover bits and pieces. Probably doesn't mess with the shark because they aren't going to get all the little bits and pieces anyway. But these guys benefit. Or birds that follow herd animals on the prairie. The herd animals kick up lots of insects and then they can feed on them. Facilitation is either plus plus or zero plus. So it's different than commensalism. It's where one species makes it easier for the other species to survive without that direct intimate contact. So for example, there's some plants like the black rush that can do a lot to make the soil in an area much more hospitable for other plants. They don't have any direct interaction, but just the fact that this one is here makes it way easier for other plants to grow. And you can see it here, a 50% increase in plant biodiversity if that Juncus plant is around than when it's not around. And here's just a kind of a review of what those are for you to take a look at. So at this point, do concept check 54.1 on page 1215, numbers 1 and 2. When you're done, we'll meet you back here and we'll handle the next section. All right, folks, welcome back. We're dealing with the stuff that's in chapter 54.2 of your book. We're going to start looking at biodiversity stuff. So diversity and trophic structure characterize biological communities. So diversity is the number and abundance of different types of organisms, and trophic structure is, the different levels, like producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, that sort of thing. In general, a few species in a community can exert strong control on that community structure. So we'll take a look at that in this section. And there are two fundamental features of community structure that we're going to look at, which is species diversity and feeding relationships. We'll start off with the species diversity. So species diversity of a community is the variety of organisms that make up the community. Okay. So how many different types of organisms are there out there? Now, if you really want to get a full picture of the diversity, you got to take into account two different aspects of it. One, species richness, which is the number of different species in a community. So how many different species do you have in this community? And secondly, relative abundance or evenness. So you could have a diverse community where you got 98 squirrels, gray squirrels. You got one red squirrel, one fox squirrel, and one blanding squirrel. You got 4 squirrels, but it's pretty much all the one. And so you wouldn't really think of that as diverse. If you walked into a forest where you had like 25 of each of those, that would feel much more diverse to you. You'd see a bunch of different squirrels pretty often. So which of these two communities here is more diverse? Pause it and tell me. Well, they're both equally diverse as far as richness goes. They both have 4 different species. But community 1 is better as far as the relative abundance of them, because they're more evenly spread out. You can walk through the forest, you'll see all the different trees. Community 2, you can walk through the forest and only see the one type of tree. So diversity can be compared using a diversity index, such as Simpson's diversity index, which you do have in the AP Bio sheet, and this is it right here, where little n equals the total number of organisms for a particular species. Big N equals the total number of organisms of all species, total number of living things in the ecosystem or habitat or whatever you're looking at. What you do is you do the sum of, like if I have, 97 gray squirrels over 100 squirrels total, and I'd square that number, and then I'd add that to the one red squirrel over 100 squared, add that to the other one and the other one, and take 1 minus, and that will give us our diversity index. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at one here, an example. So here we're looking at this forest, and we're going to count up how many of the different types of organisms we have. So got them circled over here so you can see where they're all at. You can see these eagles here, 4 of those for A. B, we've got those red-winged blackbirds, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So we've got the numbers here. So now let's apply it to the Simpson's Diversity Index. So the total number of animals, if we added them all up, after we did our counting, we have 17. So big N equals 17. So there's our 17. Then we'll divide each species number, little n, which is just here, right? So for species A, little n is 4. So 4 divided by 17, and then we'll square it. Then we'll do 3 divided by 17 for B, right? B was 3. Then we'll square it. Do that all the way along. So divide, square, then add. So we divided and squared here. We can see what those numbers are. Now let's square it. Or we already squared it, sorry. Now let's add it up. We get this number. Okay, so we're almost there, but now we just need to do 1 minus that number. That gives us our diversity index. So fairly diverse, fairly larger number of species, and fairly evenly distributed amongst them for the most part. So 0.846. All right, here is one here, guys. But if you're looking at the notes online, don't cheat. I want you to do this one on your own, and then we'll come back and see how you did. So pause it, work through this, and I'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome back. How did that go? Let's see how you did. So in total, big N, there are 65 individuals in this population. So that's why our denominator here is 65 all the way across. Species A, we had 3. B, we had 5. C, we had 16, and so on. So we divide 3 divided by 65 and square it, and that's the number we get. 5 divided by 65, then square that number. That's what we get. Do it all the way along. Add them all up, and you should get this. And then we just got to remember we got to subtract it from 1 to get a diversity index. 1 minus 0.144. So we're at a little bit bigger number than last time, just a little bit, like 100th bigger, 0.856. Okay. If you need to take a longer look at this, pause it. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. So what does that number mean? The value of the index ranges between 0 and 1. Okay. The greater the value, the bigger the number, the greater the sample diversity. Okay. So a way to think about it is the index represents the probability that 2 individuals randomly selected from the sample will belong to different species. So the closer it is to 1, the better the chance that 2 random people you pick out of that, 2 random organisms you pick, are going to be from different species. Okay. So which of ours was more diverse? The second one had a slightly bigger number, so it was slightly more diverse according to this index, this measure. So we know that we can measure diversity, but why is diversity important? What are some benefits to it? We're always worried about biodiversity. Well, we can manipulate diversity in experimental communities to study the potential benefits of diversity. For example, the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve in Minnesota, for 2 decades, did some diversity studies. So year after year after year after year, and planted plots with different amounts of diversity in them to see how they performed year after year. What they found in that study and a bunch of other ones is the communities with higher diversity are, 1, they tend to be more productive. They produce more biomass, which is the total mass of all the organisms. So they produce more biomass when they're more diverse. They tend to be more stable in their productivity. They tend to, from year to year to year, produce similar biomasses. They're less likely to have big fluctuations up or down. They're better able to withstand and recover from environmental stresses, like drought or things of that nature, and they're more resistant to invasive species. Organisms have become established outside their native range, right? They're less likely to be dramatically affected if something new moves in. So, any ideas on why we see these results from a more biodiverse ecosystem or community? Yeah, we don't entirely know everything, but what most ecologists tend to think is that with more biodiversity, the total number of organisms in that community are better able to capture all the resources available, and that leaves fewer resources for the invasive species. It also means that No one is, if anything happens to one species, there's still a lot of other species that can pick up the slack and kind of cover that niche. So that's why the biomass and productivity tends to stay higher. If there's a disease or something like that, or environmental stress, some are better with this type of stress, some are better with that type of stress. So that diversity, they help prop each other up in that situation. So that was biodiversity. Now let's take a look at trophic structure. Trophic structure is or are the feeding relationships between organisms in a community. We've talked about this already, food chains and food webs. So we're going to go through this pretty quick. So how many producers do you have, determines how many primary consumers, and so on. Reminder that food webs are basically all the different food chains in a community linked together. Species may play a role at more than one trophic level. They may eat, like, omnivores are perfect, right? They eat, plant material, but they also eat primary consumers and sometimes even secondary consumers. They can be at all sorts of different levels. Limits on food chain length, we mentioned this before. Each food chain in a food web is usually only a few links long. Basically, that's the energetic hypothesis. The length is limited by inefficient energy transfer. So at any given level, maybe 10% on average of the material that's taken in gets converted into biomass available for energy for the next link in the chain. So we generally see food chains 5 or less trophic levels because of that. That has been studied, and we've done experiments with that. So we can manipulate that. So one thing that I would say is if you're in an area with high photosynthetic production, like you produce a lot of producers producing a lot of calories, you can probably sustain a longer food chain or more links in the chain because you're starting with more energy at the bottom end. And so what they did is they took, in this particular little mini ecosystem of tree holes, they left the normal amount of producers to feed the consumers, and then they went less and less on those producers. And when you took away producers, you lost, up here you were nearly 5 links in the chain, here you're 3, and down here barely over 1 when you had very little producers. Now, in many ecosystems or in communities, a single species might have a very large impact on the community. And that impact can either come from them being like just a ton of them around, in which case they're going to have a lot of influence, or they could play a pretty pivotal role in community dynamics. They have a very important ecological function in that particular ecosystem. Dominant species are those that are the most abundant or have the highest biomass, so they take up the most of the space. One hypothesis suggests that dominant species are most competitive in exploiting resources. That's why they became dominant. Another hypothesis is that the dominant species are the most successful at avoiding predators, so they're able to live longer because they're not getting eaten. In reality, it's probably a bit of both, and it's probably specific to any particular species. Some might be better at exploiting resources, others might be better at avoiding predation. Regardless, that particular combination means there's a lot of them. Invasive species may become dominant because they lack predators, disease, and or effective competition. So when you got some new organism moving into an area that's never been there before, nobody around there eats them, there's no diseases for them there, we reduce all those limiting factors for them, and so they become dominant just by the fact that they don't have any effective competition or disease or anything else holding their numbers down. One way to discover the impact of a dominant species is to remove it from the community, obviously. An unfortunate example of this is when chestnut blight came to Eastern North America and killed almost all the American chestnut trees. They made up like 40% of the forests, which is really sad. That was before I was born even, so I didn't get to see too many of them. Removal of the dominant species can have a small impact on some species and severe impacts on others. Like got rid of all those chestnuts, other trees in those forests, the oaks, the maples and things, they benefited because they didn't have the competition. They got more of them, whereas it didn't seem to affect the mammals too much in those areas, but it did affect some moths and birds and things that relied on the chestnut trees. Now, that was dominant species. Let's take a look at keystone species. Keystone species exert strong control on a community by their ecological role or their niche. Um, so it's not that they're necessarily the most abundant. In fact, there may not be all that many of them, but their role has an outsized impact on everything else. So, for instance, this particular sea star right here, you see it's eating this mollusk, this mussel, I think it is. Uh, it eats those. Not a lot of these, but they feed on these mollusks, and if and so then those mollusks can't eat the other things or take over. But so that's with the uh, control group where you've actually got these sea stars in the area. The number of species present is pretty high. If you get rid of those sea stars, now all of a sudden those mussels don't have any predators, so their population explodes, and they start going crazy at taking up space and eating everything else, and so your species diversity gets really low. Um, so it's that kind of positive negative. If you remove part of a food chain, you can have effects below it and above it. So if you remove an upper level of the food chain, the trophic level right below that is going to get bigger, and the trophic level below that one is going to get smaller because it's going to get overfed on, and so on. Kind of that back and forth going on. And some species, just by the nature of their niche, can play a huge role in that, and we call those keystone species. Ecosystem engineers, otherwise called foundation species, um, cause actual physical changes in the environment that affect community structure. Beavers are the prime example, right? With their dams, they greatly change the landscapes in the areas where they're living. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples of that. So, bringing a stream back to life. Okay, so if you have an area where beaver trapping and overgrazing has caused the creeks to basically collapse in on themselves and get these narrow, deep channels, which is great if you don't care about the land over here. Stuff goes through fast and quick, and it doesn't water the land too much. So what you do is they add in these little strainer dams, and these strainer dams tend to widen out the stream because it slows down the water flow, causes the water to kind of bust into the banks a little bit, breaking off, providing more sediment, which fills in the bottom, so the streams become more shallow and wider and slower, and that allows beavers to come and recolonize, okay, because they can't do these really fast, tight little streams. So the beavers start to recolonize. They build dams, which now we don't have to do them, and it widens it and broadens it. And we get our floodplains back, and we get a lot more habitat for things, and it really makes a nice, complex, biodiverse habitat in that area where we didn't have it before. And you can see the water table here growing over time. The water table comes right back up. We hold more water on the land, less of it flows away out to the rivers and the oceans, and we have a more well-watered area. It's really amazing how much difference they make. Um, Bottom up and top down controls. Um, these two hypotheses I think are good for illustrative purposes, but I don't think either one holds all the time in all situations. So the bottom up model of community organization proposes a unidirectional influence from the lower to the higher trophic levels. What we mean there is, so if we got our nutrients in the soil, so we got nutrients, vegetation, herbivores, and predators. If we increase the nutrient amounts, we will get more plants, which will allow us to have more herbivores, which will allow us to have more predators. We can increase the biomass of the ecosystem by influencing the nutrients, okay? Fertilizing, for instance, right? So if we increase something down here, it'll increase up here. If we decrease something down here, it'll decrease the ones up above. The top-down model, also called the trophic cascade, proposes the control comes from the trophic level above. So we've kind of mentioned this before, right? If we get rid of these predators, like those sea stars, right, then the herbivores are going to go up, and then the vegetation is going to go down, and then the nutrients are going to go up. Okay, and we can see that we do some of that in like lakes. If we want to, change the amount of phytoplankton in the lake or whatever, we might, depending on how many trophic levels there are, we might get rid of one top predator or somebody in the middle to try to affect that. Basically these up, those down, these up, those down kind of situations. In reality, it's probably a bit of both. Some ecosystems might be more strongly influenced bottom up, some might be more strongly influenced top down, but there's always going to be an interplay of both of those. Okay, you can't knock it down to just one. All right, that'll do it for this topic in AP Biology. So at this point, if you could go and do the concept checks for 54.2 on pages 1221, numbers 1, 2, and 3, and then you can do the topic questions for 8.5, the community ecology quiz. We'll talk about those when we're in class, and then after that, we'll get started on the next section of notes, 8.6. See you then.